something is unfolding quietly beneath the silence, and if you've been sensing it, it isn't just your imagination. A decision is slowly taking shape in the private space of their emotions, and somehow your presence is part of it. On the surface, they may appear composed, distant, or even indifferent, but underneath, something far more intense is shifting. A truth they once avoided is now too heavy to push away. This isn't only about missing you or wondering whether they come closer or drift away for good. It's about what your connection stirred inside them, what it uncovered, and what it forced them to face when escape stopped working. What is building now isn't minor or temporary. It feels like a turning point that could redirect the direction of their life, and whatever choice they make, they won't walk away unchanged. Behind it all, there is a deeper layer you may not immediately notice. This is not just about absence or emotional distance. It is about what your presence activated within them, what it brought to the surface, and what they could no longer keep buried. At first, they tried to act normal, filling their time with routine, distraction, pride, and silence, convincing themselves the intensity would eventually fade. But certain connections don't disappear like that. The more they tried to push it away, the more it remained alive inside them. What you shared reached far deeper than surface attraction. It touched protected parts of their identity they rarely expose. Now they are not only thinking about you, but also examining their own reactions, choices, and emotional patterns, and something within them is starting to question the story they once relied on for comfort. Inside them, two opposing forces are pulling in different directions. One part feels an undeniable pull toward you, something instinctive and hard to explain. Your absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels unfinished, like something unresolved that keeps resurfacing in quiet moments. Yet another part resists just as strongly, because admitting the depth of what they feel would require emotional exposure they have long avoided. It would mean dropping defenses, stepping out of control, and allowing vulnerability to surface. That kind of honesty can be unsettling because it challenges the identity they've relied on to feel secure. Now the tension is building to a point where it can no longer be ignored. They are no longer only pushing the feeling away, they are beginning to sit with it, and that changes everything. At this threshold, the outcome depends on whether fear or truth becomes stronger. If they return, it will not be because circumstances became easier, but because they finally recognized the value of what was shared and understood that such connections are rare. If they leave, it does not reflect your worth or depth of feeling. It reflects their readiness to face emotional responsibility. Your role now is not to force direction or chase answers, but to allow clarity to emerge on its own. What is happening inside them is not a passing thought, but a deep internal conflict between attachment and protection. One side carries warmth, memory, and longing. The other is shaped by past hurt, and the instinct to stay guarded. These forces are colliding, and the pressure is shaping a decision they cannot avoid. You became a turning point in their emotional world, if they still trying to understand what means. It reached the version of them that lives underneath control, beneath the image they present, beneath all the careful habits they built to feel safe. And now they are standing in front of a difficult inner split. They can stay within the familiar limits of who they have always been, or they can move toward a version of themselves they don't fully know yet, one that would require openness, emotional risk, and courage they are not used to using. This inner pressure is draining them, and you can see it in the inconsistency you've been noticing. The distance, the sudden warmth, the pull forward, and then the retreat again. It is not always about playing games. Sometimes it is what happens when someone wants connection deeply but is also afraid of what it might change inside them. As this continues, the illusions they relied on start to fall apart. They can no longer easily convince themselves that this was nothing meaningful or something that would fade on its own. Instead, they are being pushed into a clearer awareness of both you and themselves. Old memories resurface without warning. Emotions they thought were settled come back with more intensity. Even silence feels louder now, and your absence carries more weight than before. Without distraction filling the space, they are left alone with what they feel, and that emptiness becomes a reflection they cannot avoid. In that reflection, they begin to notice what your presence actually meant and what its absence has taken with it. In quiet moments, they start making comparisons they did not intend to make. Not in a calculated way, but emotionally, instinctively. What they experienced with you begins to stand out in contrast to everything else, not because it was perfect, but because it felt deeper, more real, more emotionally alive. That recognition is what pushes them toward an internal turning point. They can no longer comfortably exist in a half-in, half-out state. Something in them is demanding honesty now, even if they are not ready to fully accept it yet. At the center of this struggle is a growing tension between what they feel and what they fear, and neither side is willing to stay quiet. This is why everything feels like a storm inside them. Fear pulls them backward into safety, into what is familiar and controlled, while desire keeps drawing them towards something more honest and unfamiliar. Both feel valid to them, which is exactly why the conflict is so exhausting. They are not simply deciding about a connection. They are confronting a deeper question about who they become when they stop protecting themselves in the same old ways. And eventually, that inner pressure cannot stay unresolved. One side will begin to take over. Either fear will keep them distant, or truth will push them toward change they can no longer delay. It is about who they decide to become from this point forward, and that moment is approaching faster than it seems. Until now, they've been stuck in hesitation, circling the same thoughts, replaying memories, analyzing signs, and trying to manage something that has always been bigger than logic. But emotions with real weight don't stay unresolved forever. Everything they've been feeling, confusion, longing, reflection, has been moving toward a single unavoidable outcome, a decision, a real one. And as that moment gets closer, they may seem more withdrawn or inconsistent. But distance doesn't always signal an ending. Sometimes it is the final stage before truth can no longer be delayed. They are beginning to feel that staying in between is no longer sustainable. Being neither fully present nor fully gone has become exhausting, keeping them emotionally stuck and unsettled. Now they are being pushed toward responsibility for what they feel, and that requires honesty. Honesty removes the comfort of excuses. It forces a question they can't avoid, whether they are willing to risk the safety of what they know for something that requires growth and vulnerability. The phase of uncertainty is slowly closing, and something more decisive is beginning to form. Deep down, they recognize this isn't just another fleeting emotional moment. It feels like a turning point that leaves a lasting mark. What once felt like hesitation is starting to feel like confinement, because avoiding the choice never truly protected them, it only kept them stagnant. And stillness, over time, becomes its own form of discomfort. As this awareness grows, they begin noticing the distance between what they felt and how they acted. The moments they stayed silent when they wanted to speak, the times they pulled away when they felt drawn closer, even the way pride replaced honesty in key moments. This realization is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying, because it begins to close the gap between inner feeling and outward behavior. And once that gap starts closing, change is no longer optional, it becomes unavoidable. For a long time, they were able to hide their emotions even from themselves, relying on logic, distance, and silence as protection. But feelings rooted deeply enough do not stay contained forever. In quiet moments, when distractions fade, the truth keeps returning. Now they are starting to see the pattern in what once felt random, the connection, the memories, the emotions. It all begins to form a clearer picture. And perhaps the most important realization is not just about missing you, but about missing who they became when they were connected to you. More open, more present, more emotionally alive. That version of themselves feels distant now, and that absence is becoming harder to ignore. As this recognition deepens, external distractions lose their influence. Life continues around them, but internally there is a constant pull back toward what felt real and unfinished. And now they are standing between two paths. The familiar comfort of emotional distance, or the uncertain possibility of something that feels more honest than anything they've known before. That's where real courage actually begins, not when fear disappears, but when truth finally becomes more important than it. And in that shift, something subtle changes inside them. The chaos of overthinking starts to settle. The tension doesn't vanish, but it transforms. It becomes more focused, more grounded, less like panic and more like awareness. They are no longer pushing every feeling away the moment it appears. Instead, they are starting to let those feelings exist without immediately rejecting them. And in that acceptance, a quiet kind of relief begins to form. Not because everything is resolved, but because the internal conflict is no longer as violent. The war inside is slowly turning into something closer to clarity. They are now standing at the edge of an older version of themselves, looking towards something unfamiliar but real. And the only real bridge between where they've been and where they could go is honesty. This is the moment where silence stops being protective and starts becoming reflective. It begins to show them everything they once overlooked, where pride replaced openness, where fear interrupted connection, where avoidance quietly created distance that didn't have to exist. They start revisiting memories, conversations, pauses, and emotional moments, but now with more awareness, more emotional depth, and more honesty toward themselves. And in that reflection, they can no longer deny the role fear played in their choices. This isn't only about regret. It's about reevaluating what actually matters. Things like image, control, emotional distance, or self-protection begin to feel less significant when placed next to something that felt genuinely meaningful. And alongside that, something else starts to develop: empathy. They begin to sense, even faintly at first, what their absence or withdrawal may have felt like from your side. That awareness changes something in them. It softens their internal defenses. It makes it harder to stay detached, because once accountability enters the picture, denial becomes harder to maintain. They are no longer just reacting to fear. They are starting to take responsibility for their emotional reality. At this stage, their decisions begin to feel more serious, even if nothing outwardly has changed yet. The hesitation that once filled the space between thoughts starts to lose its weight. What remains is something quieter but stronger. The recognition that avoiding truth is also a decision, and often the most painful one. This clarity is not just mental, it's emotional and physical. It shows up in still moments, in the body, in the quiet pressure of everything left unsaid. The unknown still carries fear, but the emotional emptiness of staying disconnected begins to feel even harder to tolerate. And so, movement begins to feel closer. Thoughts that were once held back start rising. Actions that once felt impossible begin to feel less distant. Because when truth becomes this present, silence stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like limitation. Whatever comes next will not be random. It will come from a long internal process of finally facing themselves without excuses. And that makes this moment significant, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but deeply defining. At the core of it all is one simple truth. Something in you affected them in a way they can no longer ignore. And now, as clarity replaces confusion, they are left with a choice that is no longer about uncertainty, but about what they will do with what they now understand. If you've been sensing a shift, don't dismiss it. Something in this situation may feel like it is reaching its final stage, as though an inner process is quietly moving toward completion. The other person is approaching a point where a decision becomes unavoidable, one that reflects whether they are willing to act from honesty instead of fear. In moments like this, the most important thing on your side is steadiness. Stay grounded in yourself. Stay clear about what you feel and what you don't need to chase. There is no need to force clarity in someone who is already being confronted by their own emotions. Sometimes silence is not emptiness. It is pressure turning into awareness, and awareness slowly shaping direction. What unfolds next will likely reveal more than words ever could. Their inner confusion is gradually shifting into something more defined, even if it is still unspoken. The distance, the hesitation, and the back-and-forth energy are all moving toward a breaking point where one truth begins to outweigh everything else. When that moment arrives, it will not just reflect how they feel, it will reflect how they handle truth when it is no longer easy to avoid. And whatever comes next, it will be shaped by that confrontation. So if this speaks to what you've been noticing, hold your center without trying to control the outcome. Often, the quietest phase is the one right before clarity becomes impossible to ignore. What I am describing is essentially the emotional pressure phase that happens when someone can no longer keep a comfortable distance from what they feel. It's the point where avoidance stops working as a coping strategy, and the mind starts circling the same truth repeatedly. That doesn't automatically mean someone will act in a certain way or come to a specific decision, but it does mean their internal world is no longer stable in the way it was when they could still distract themselves or simplify what they felt. In real psychology, this often looks less like a dramatic turning point and more like increasing cognitive and emotional dissonance. A person holds two competing experiences at once: what they feel internally and the story they've been telling themselves to stay in control. The discomfort comes from that mismatch. Over time, the brain naturally tries to reduce that tension, either by changing behavior, reinterpreting the situation, or emotionally detaching. Which direction it goes depends on personality, attachment style, past experiences, and current life circumstances, not just the intensity of one connection. What can feel like shift, silence, or distance becoming meaningful is often just the mind reallocating attention. When someone is stressed or conflicted, they don't process emotions linearly, they cycle. One moment they feel clarity, the next they feel doubt, then they rationalize, then they withdraw again. From the outside, that can look like a meaningful pattern moving toward a single conclusion, but internally, it is usually more unstable and less directional than it appears. It's also important to be careful with the idea that absence automatically creates realization, or that distance reliably increases emotional value. Sometimes it does lead to reflection, but other times it leads to habituation. People adapt to the absence and emotionally down-regulate the attachment. Human response is not one-directional. The same silence that creates longing in one person can create closure in another. Where things become clearer and more grounded is when you shift focus away from trying to decode the other person's internal state and toward what is actually observable and reciprocal. Consistency, communication, and behavior over time are far more reliable than inferred emotional tension. Intensity in thought does not always translate into intention in action. At the same time, the experience you're pointing to, feeling like something is unresolved and emotionally in motion, is real in the sense that humans do carry unfinished emotional loops. The brain does revisit meaningful connections, especially when they involved vulnerability or emotional activation. Those loops don't necessarily mean a decision is forming toward reunion or separation. They simply mean the emotional system has not fully closed the file yet. If there is a useful way to hold all of this, it's that internal conflict in another person is not a signal you can reliably steer or interpret into certainty. It is their process, and it may resolve in more than one direction, including none of the expected ones. What you can actually rely on is how you are being treated in the present, not the imagined endpoint of someone else's internal struggle. When a situation feels emotionally intense but externally quiet, the mind tends to fill the gap with interpretation. Silence is uncomfortable for the human brain, so it tries to complete the story using memory, hope, fear, and pattern recognition. That's why distance can start to feel meaningful even when nothing concrete is happening. The emotional system doesn't wait for facts. It reacts to uncertainty as if it is information in itself. In that space, attachment becomes more active, not less. The less clarity there is, the more the mind loops through possibilities. It replays past moments, reinterprets tone, searches for signs, and assigns meaning to small changes in behavior. This is not irrational. It's how the brain tries to regain a sense of control, but it can create the feeling that something is building or unfolding on the other side, even when the only real movement is internal processing, not mutual direction. A key point that often gets missed is that emotional intensity does not equal relational movement. Someone can be thinking deeply, feeling conflicted, or even emotionally activated without that translating into action, commitment, or clarity. Internal experiences are private and can remain unresolved for long periods without ever turning into external change. This is where perception often becomes misleading, because what is felt inside is mistaken for what is happening between two people. Another important layer is how uncertainty itself becomes emotionally sticky. The brain prefers either certainty or closure, even if the outcome is painful. But ambiguity keeps the attachment system on. It's like a loop that never fully shuts down, because there is no final signal, no clear yes or no. That in-between state can feel powerful, but it's also mentally exhausting because it prevents emotional resolution. Over time, the healthiest anchor is not trying to decode what someone might be feeling in silence, but tracking what is consistently expressed through action. Real emotional availability is not hidden in distant signals or interpreted pauses. It shows up in reliability, communication, and willingness to be present in a clear way. And when you remove the storytelling layer, what often remains is simpler than it feels. You either have mutual, visible effort, or you are left with uncertainty that the mind keeps trying to turn into meaning. Another layer to understand here is how the brain assigns meaning to emotionally charged connections. When someone leaves a strong emotional imprint, the nervous system doesn't treat it like a regular memory. It stores it with heightened significance. That's why certain people or experiences can feel alive in your mind long after the actual interaction has slowed down. The emotional imprint continues to activate even in silence, especially when there was vulnerability, uncertainty, or inconsistency involved. In those conditions, the mind starts to treat gaps in information as something it must solve. So instead of accepting not knowing, it generates explanations. It builds narratives around distance, timing, behavior shifts, and silence. This creates a sense of ongoing emotional motion, even when externally nothing is changing. It can feel like something is developing, but in many cases, it is the mind continuing unfinished processing rather than reflecting a real-time relational shift. Inconsistent connection patterns tend to amplify this effect. When someone is sometimes present and sometimes distant, the brain becomes more alert, not less. Intermittent reinforcement, moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, creates a stronger psychological loop than consistent behavior would. That doesn't mean there is hidden intention or deeper certainty behind it. It simply means unpredictability increases attention and emotional investment. What often gets misunderstood in these experiences is the difference between emotional activation and relational reality. Emotional activation is what happens inside you, thinking, longing, interpreting, remembering. Relational reality is what is consistently expressed between two people, communication, effort, clarity, and action. When those two don't match, the mind tends to favor the internal experience because it feels more intense and immediate, even if it's less reliable. Another important truth is that silence does not carry information by itself. It is neutral until behavior gives it meaning. But the human mind rarely experiences it as neutral. It turns silence into potential, fear, hope, or significance depending on what it already wants or fears. That's why two people can experience the same silence in completely opposite ways. Eventually, the most stabilizing shift comes from recentering attention on what is observable and reciprocal, rather than inferred. Not because inner reflection is wrong, but because it is easy for interpretation to become a substitute for clarity. And clarity, in real emotional situations, is almost always shown through consistency over time, not through ambiguity, distance, or imagined meaning. At some point in these emotional loops, what actually starts happening is a gradual shift in where your energy is going. Instead of the situation itself changing, your attention becomes more concentrated on trying to interpret it. That creates the feeling of depth and progression, even when the external reality is still undefined. The mind can turn uncertainty into a kind of ongoing narrative, where every pause feels like it has meaning, and every silence feels like it is saying something. But underneath that narrative layer, nothing is actually being confirmed. It's important to separate the emotional story your mind is building from the factual signals that exist in real life. Emotional stories tend to be rich, layered, and constantly evolving because they are powered by imagination, memory, and hope. Real-world signals are usually much simpler: consistency, effort, communication, and follow-through. When those are missing or unstable, no amount of interpretation can turn them into certainty. Another important aspect is how attachment reacts to uncertainty. When there is no clear resolution, the attachment system stays active. It doesn't turn off just because there is distance. Instead, it keeps scanning for meaning, especially in patterns, timing changes, and emotional highs and lows. This is why silence can sometimes feel louder than communication. It gives the mind space to fill in the blanks continuously. So the deeper truth in all of this is that the mind prefers a complex explanation because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, but real emotional reality is usually much simpler and more observable than the stories we build around it. The next step in understanding this is realizing how strongly the human mind resists unfinished emotional loops. When something feels unresolved, especially with emotional intensity attached to it, the brain treats it like an open task. It keeps returning to it automatically, not because there is hidden meaning being revealed, but because the system dislikes incomplete patterns. That's why thoughts can feel repetitive and persistent even when nothing new is actually happening. Over time, this creates the experience of emotional momentum, like something is still in motion between you and another person. But in many cases, what is actually moving is your attention, not the relationship itself. Attention keeps revisiting the same emotional material, reprocessing it in slightly different ways, trying to extract certainty from something that currently has none. Another important piece is how meaning becomes amplified in the absence of closure. When there is no clear ending or clear continuation, the mind tends to elevate significance. It assumes that if something still feels active internally, it must also be active externally. But internal activation is not the same as shared reality. One can exist without the other. This is also where emotional projection becomes subtle. The brain fills in the unknown with possibilities shaped by desire, fear, or memory. If a connection felt deep, the mind may continue to assign it ongoing importance, even if the actual dynamic has slowed or become unclear. That doesn't make the feelings fake. It just means feelings alone are not a reliable indicator of what is happening on both sides. Over time, this can keep someone emotionally engaged long after the real-world structure of the connection has changed. Not because something is actively developing, but because the nervous system is still responding to what once felt meaningful. That response can feel like intuition or insight, but often it is just unresolved emotional imprint continuing to surface. The most stabilizing realization in all of this is that clarity does not come from thinking harder about someone else's silence. It comes from observing whether the connection is producing real, consistent behavior in the present. If it is not, then what remains is not hidden meaning, it is uncertainty that the mind is trying to complete on its own. This is also why these situations can feel so consuming. The lack of resolution keeps the attachment system active. It doesn't allow emotional energy to fully settle, so your thoughts continue cycling through the same material in search of a conclusion. In that state, even neutral events can feel loaded with meaning because your mind is already primed to interpret everything through the lens of unfinished emotion. A key shift happens when you begin to separate emotional intensity from actual evidence. Intensity is what you feel internally: hope, fear, longing, curiosity, attachment. Evidence is what consistently exists outside of interpretation, communication, effort, presence, and clarity. When those two are not aligned, it becomes very easy to get pulled into a narrative that feels emotionally true, but is not necessarily supported by consistent reality. And this is where real grounding begins. Not in trying to stop your feelings, and not in forcing yourself to let go instantly, but in slowly returning your attention to what is actually being shown to you. Because clarity is not something you extract from silence, it is something that is demonstrated through continuity. If continuity is not there, then your mind will keep trying to create it, but that creation is internal, not mutual. So the final truth in all of this is simple. Even if it feels difficult at first, you don't need to decode absence, you need to respond to reality. If something is real and reciprocal, it becomes clearer over time without effortful interpretation. If something remains unclear for a long time, it is not your job to turn that uncertainty into certainty through thinking. Your clarity will come not from understanding someone else's silence, but from recognizing what is and is not consistently present in your life. And once that shift happens, something important changes. The emotional noise doesn't disappear immediately, but it loses authority. You stop treating every thought as a signal and every silence as a message. You begin to see the difference between what you feel and what is actually happening. And in that space, even without all the answers, you start to regain something much more stable than interpretation: perspective.